All right, settle in, you romantic fools. Are you currently scrolling through YouTube, saving videos of rustic barn weddings, dreaming of a fairy tale day, complete with twinkling lights and a perfectly curated aesthetic? Thinking about castles, perhaps? A dashing, velvet-clad suitor sweeping you off your feet, a grand hall filled with merriment, and a lifetime of blissful, mutual adoration. Well, congratulations. You've successfully conjured a fantasy that would make any actual medieval person choke on their unfiltered ale. Because, let me tell you, thinking about that fairy tale wedding? Forget the castles, think cholera. Forget Prince Charming, think arranged marriage with a guy who probably smells like sheep and hasn't bathed since last Michaelmas, which, for those keeping score, was about 11 months ago. And good luck getting him to floss. Ever. Seriously, the dental hygiene alone was enough to make one consider a lifetime of monastic celibacy. Your idyllic vision of medieval matrimony is about as historically accurate as a unicorn wearing a smartwatch. No, this isn't your grandma's cozy history channel where we gently gloss over the less savory bits and pretend everyone was just dandy and noble. Oh no. This is a deep dive, a brutal plunge into the utterly unromantic, often grotesque reality of medieval nuptials. We're going to drag you through the mud, the squalor, and the crushing societal expectations of a wedding day that was less about I do and more about I'm done for. We're serving it all up with a generous side of dark humor, a heavy dose of sarcasm, and a profound, bone-deep relief that you, dear viewer, have the distinct privilege of living in the present day. Because if you truly understood what these poor souls went through, you'd probably kiss the nearest Wi-Fi router in gratitude. So, prepare yourselves. We're about to explore a world where forever often meant until the plague hits. Love was a concept largely reserved for troubadours and unfortunate poets, and your spouse was chosen for you with all the warmth and personal consideration of ordering livestock. We're talking no choice in partner, no concept of romantic love, and a very, very high chance of debilitating disease making a surprise appearance at your reception. Oh, and did I mention the public consummation? Yeah, that was a thing. Get ready to feel an overwhelming surge of gratitude for your single status, if that's where you are, or at least a renewed appreciation for your modern marriage, with its quaint notions of consent, personal hygiene, and the option to actually choose who you spend eternity, or at least the next few decades with. This is not a story for the faint of heart or the romantically delusional. This is a story about why getting married in the Middle Ages fundamentally and unequivocally sucked. Let's begin by ruthlessly dismantling the most pervasive lie perpetuated by Hollywood and centuries of bad romance novels. The idea that medieval marriage was about love, or even, perish the thought, butterflies. Those fluttering sensations in your stomach? In the Middle Ages, they were more likely a symptom of dysentery than nascent affection. The truth, cold and unyielding as a January morning in a drafty castle, is that medieval marriage was overwhelmingly a business transaction. It was a strategic asset, a merger and acquisition deal, a political alliance forged with all the warmth of an IRS audit. Forget soulmates, think spreadsheets. Forget shared dreams, think shared acreage. Your other half was less a poetic ideal and more a convenient legal instrument for consolidating land, securing allegiances, or simply moving your family up a notch or two on the socioeconomic ladder. The concept of love, as we understand it today, that dizzying, all-consuming, personal connection that forms the very bedrock of our modern unions, was largely an external, almost alien concept to the institution of marriage itself. Oh, love existed, sure, but it was often a courtly, idealized, highly stylized affair, usually conducted outside of matrimony, and frequently with someone else's spouse. It was the stuff of epic poems, of forbidden glances across a tourney field, of secret assignations in moonlit gardens. It was the kind of dangerous, thrilling passion that generally led to scandal, illegitimate children, or the untimely demise of at least one party involved. It was not the dull domestic affection one cultivated with the person with whom one was expected to share a bed, a lineage, and a lifetime of practical arrangements. So these mythical love matches you might hear whispered about, those were rarer than finding a perfectly cooked steak that didn't risk giardia.
They were the unicorns of the medieval dating scene, often leading to tragic ends precisely because they dared to defy the pragmatic, unsentimental logic of the age. So, where did your heart's desires fit into this grand scheme of things? Short answer, they didn't. Your personal preference, your fleeting infatuations, your profound crushes on the stable boy with surprisingly clean fingernails, all utterly, completely, hilariously irrelevant. These precious, tender sentiments were meaningless when stacked against your family's ledger, the intricate tapestry of landholdings, or the pressing need to secure a more advantageous lineage. Your emotions were a luxury your family simply couldn't afford to indulge. You weren't a person with agency. You were a piece on a very elaborate chessboard, a living pawn to be moved and traded for the greater good of the family name, the estate, or the lord's political maneuvering. Did you have a crush on someone? Adorable. Now, did they own 300 acres of prime arable land and have a cousin in the king's privy council? No? Then move along. Your feelings were at best a charming eccentricity, at worst an active impediment to your family's strategic ambitions. Your personal happiness was about as important as the precise shade of dirt on your boots, perhaps noted, but utterly inconsequential to the grand design. So, with the romantic illusions thoroughly pulverized, let's get down to the brass tacks of spouse selection. In the glorious medieval era, you didn't meet someone. You certainly didn't fall in love with them. You were, far more accurately, assigned someone. Your parents, or if you were particularly unlucky, your feudal lord, made the executive decision. It was a bit like online dating, but instead of swiping right or left based on a blurry profile picture and a bio that optimistically mentioned long walks on the beach, a deeply impractical pastime in an era of muddy paths and brigands, your dad just signed you up for life with a stranger. And that stranger was chosen solely based on their land holdings, the strategic placement of their family's estate, the depth of their family's coffers, and how many pigs they owned. Personal attraction? Emotional compatibility? Shared interests? These were utterly moot points. Your only interest was to produce an heir and not openly rebel against the arrangement. The utter, soul-crushing lack of individual agency in this whole process is almost breathtaking. Imagine, for a moment, being told, "Congratulations, darling, you're going to marry Bartholomew,
He's 40, you're 12, and his family controls the adjacent boglands. What do you mean you prefer Jeffrey, the handsome stable hand? Jeffrey doesn't come with a dowry of 200 sheep and a strategically placed mill. Your life, your future, your entire existence was mapped out for you before you even learned to tie your own shoes, let alone comprehend the grim realities of matrimony. It's like applying for a job, but instead of choosing the company, your parents just sent your resume to the nearest feudal overlord, and you got whatever position they decided you were suitable for, regardless of your skills or desires. And that position often came with a less than charming, less than clean, and definitely less than enthusiastic coworker for the rest of your natural life. The reasons for these preordained unions were as cold and calculating as a winter draft in a stone castle. Foremost among them was land consolidation. Marriages were the ultimate property mergers, allowing families to expand their holdings, buttress their borders, and secure vital resources. Power was another key driver. A strategic marriage could elevate a family's standing, forge alliances with powerful neighbors, or even secure royal favor. Political alliances were paramount, turning potential enemies into nominal in-laws, thus theoretically averting costly wars and bloodshed. Sometimes it was pure social climbing, marrying into a family with a better name, even if they were slightly impoverished, could elevate your own progeny. And for the less fortunate, it was simply about avoiding utter destitution. A good marriage could secure a modicum of stability and sustenance, keeping you from the literal poorhouse. Love, however, never made the list. It was a chaotic, unreliable emotion, and the medieval world had no time for such disruptive nonsense. Efficiency, property, and power, these were the sacred vows of the age. Now, if the idea of an arranged marriage picked by your porcine-obsessed parents wasn't quite chilling enough, let's talk about the ages at which these joyful unions often occurred. You might envision a blushing bride in her late teens, perhaps early 20s, a picture of youthful grace. You'd be wrong. So very, terribly wrong. Canon law, the legal framework of the church, set the legal age for marriage at a jaw-droppingly tender 12 for girls and 14 for boys. And these were just the minimums. Customary law in various regions sometimes pushed the boundaries even further, particularly for betrothal. We're talking about children, barely out of their swaddling clothes, being legally bound for life. They were still figuring out how to properly wield a spoon, let alone navigate the complex, often brutal landscape of medieval marriage. Imagine, if you will, being younger than most middle schoolers and being told, "Congratulations, you're going to be a wife/husband. Now try not to get dirt on your wedding dress/tunic, and for God's sake, don't pick your nose during the ceremony." It's an age when many modern children are still trying to convince their parents they're old enough for a pet hamster, not a lifelong human companion. The grim, almost unbelievable truth is that this legal fiction of consent clashed violently with the physical and emotional reality. A child of 12 or 14 might be legally capable of consenting to marriage, but they were certainly not emotionally or physically prepared for its realities, especially not its intimate ones. The concept of consummation at such absurdly young ages is truly horrifying to contemplate, a stark reminder of the utterly different moral and social landscape of the time. Imagine being a teenager and having to get married, a concept already fraught with anxiety for most modern adolescents. Now, imagine you're barely out of diapers, still playing with dolls or toy swords, and suddenly you're expected to fulfill marital duties. It's not just preteen, it's often barely post-toddler.
The physical implications for young girls, whose bodies were far from developed enough to safely carry and birth children, were catastrophic. It was a biological lottery with terrifyingly high stakes. And those stakes were dramatically underlined by the brutal realities of medieval mortality rates. Marrying young, especially for girls, often led to a tragically swift widowhood, or far more commonly, death in childbirth.
Girls whose bodies weren't ready for the immense physical toll of pregnancy and delivery were thrust into this dangerous biological imperative, often with fatal consequences. You might be a child bride at 12, a mother by 13, and dead by 14, leaving behind a bewildered infant and a husband already scouting for his next childbearer. The idea of a long, happy life together was a luxury few could afford, and even fewer could realistically expect. It was a relentless cycle of procreation, loss, and remarriage, all underpinned by the casual brutality of a world that viewed young women less as individuals and more as fertile ground for the next generation of laborers or heirs. Till death do us part wasn't a romantic vow. It was a highly probable, often imminent, logistical detail. Moving swiftly from the horrifyingly young to the brutally transactional, let's talk about the dowry. The dowry. This wasn't some quaint little gift from the bride's family to help her set up house. No, no, no. The dowry was a non-negotiable, often astronomical sum of money, goods, or, most importantly, land that the bride's family was obligated to pay, or at least promise, to the groom's family. Think of it less as a wedding present and more as an elaborate, highly stressful, and financially crippling investment or settlement. It was the bride's contribution to the marital estate, often managed and controlled by the husband, and it was the primary determinant of her eligibility, desirability, and often her treatment within her new household. No dowry? Good luck finding a husband above the absolute lowest rung of society, and even then, you'd better be able to work like 3 oxen and a plow. It was, in essence, the price tag attached to the bride, a tangible representation of her economic worth, a financial sweetener to make the whole taking on a new family member thing a bit more palatable. This brings us to a stark, uncomfortable truth of medieval marriage. A woman was often viewed as chattel, as property, as an asset to be acquired. You weren't getting a soulmate. You were acquiring a living, breathing asset with a bonus uterus, some potentially useful household skills, and a dowry that, if substantial enough, made the whole endeavor worthwhile. Her value was intrinsically linked to what she brought to the marriage, not who she was. Her chastity was paramount not for some romantic ideal, but because it guaranteed the legitimacy of the heirs she would produce, thus safeguarding the husband's lineage and property rights. Her ability to manage a household was critical for the smooth running of the estate. Her very existence was, in many ways, an economic calculation, a strategic acquisition. You bought the wife. The dowry was the added bonus. It's a remarkably unromantic lens through which to view human connection. But then again, romance was never truly on the menu. Now, let's consider the concept of dower rights. This was the one glimmer of hope for a medieval woman, a slight crack in the patriarchal edifice. Dower rights stipulated what would happen if the husband died, and let's be honest, in the Middle Ages, that was a pretty frequent occurrence. Typically, a widow was entitled to a fraction of her deceased husband's land or estate, often 1/3, to support herself and her children. However, and this is a rather significant however, this wasn't guaranteed freedom or wealth. This dower was often contingent on good behavior, a conveniently vague term that could be interpreted very broadly by her deceased husband's family, and, crucially, on her not remarrying too quickly. Remarrying often meant forfeiting her dower rights to her new husband or her children, as the dower was specifically intended for her support as a widow of the previous husband. So, you might gain a brief moment of independence, but it was usually temporary, precarious, and under intense scrutiny from your former in-laws. It was a golden cage with a very easily triggered trapdoor. If you thought commoners had it rough, let's elevate our misery to the truly epic scale of noble and royal marriages. Here, personal feelings weren't just irrelevant, they were an active liability. Noble marriages were not just business transactions, they were geopolitical strategies of the highest order. These unions were designed to bind kingdoms, forge unbreakable, or at least incredibly difficult to break, alliances, end generations-long blood feuds, and secure vast swaths of territory without the messy, expensive business of actually fighting for it. A princess was a living treaty, a duke's daughter a mobile fortress. Your personal happiness, your comfort, your safety, your very existence were all negligible casualties in the grand game of thrones. You were a pawn, an incredibly high-value, jewel-bedecked pawn, but a pawn nonetheless, to be moved across the European chessboard at the whim of your monarch or powerful father. The ultimate sacrifice for the crown was, more often than not, the personal happiness, freedom, and sometimes even the survival of its royal offspring. Imagine being a young princess, perhaps raised in the gentle climes of southern France, suddenly shipped off to some frigid, damp, utterly alien kingdom to marry a gout-ridden old king 3 times your age. Or worse, to marry a child prince whose family might be overthrown in a bloody coup next Tuesday. Your life was not your own. It was a living, breathing contract, a game of feudal risk played with human pieces, where your personal sacrifice was expected, demanded, and often brutally enforced. You were a walking, talking, diplomatic tool, a human bridge between warring factions, or a very expensive insurance policy against future incursions. Your duty was to produce an heir, preferably male, and to do so without causing any international incidents. That was the job description, and it came with absolutely no benefits package for your emotional well-being. And speaking of these grand strategic unions, let's talk about the unique thrill of marrying exotic and often dangerous spouses. Imagine a sheltered English noblewoman who has barely ventured beyond the county borders suddenly being told she's marrying a duke from a German principality or a Castilian king. New languages, which you likely didn't speak a word of, new customs, some of which might seem utterly barbaric, new climates, and potentially entirely hostile environments. You're surrounded by strangers, often speaking a tongue you don't understand, and they might very well resent your presence, your foreign ways, and the political machinations that brought you there. You were a stranger in a strange land, often thousands of miles from anyone you knew, with only your new, equally strange husband for company. And he was probably too busy plotting his next military campaign to offer much in the way of comfort. This wasn't just a change of scenery. It was often a complete, terrifying immersion into an alien culture, with no safety net and absolutely no return ticket. If you thought the actual wedding ceremony was the point of no return, think again. In medieval times, the true point of no return was often the betrothal, a prenuptial agreement of doom that was frequently as legally binding, if not more so, than the marriage itself. This wasn't just a casual promise over a pint of lukewarm ale. This was a solemn, often public, and legally enforceable contract. Once you were betrothed, you were, for all intents and purposes, considered married in the eyes of the church and the law, even if you hadn't shared a bed or exchanged final vows. It was a handshake deal that might as well have been signed in blood, because backing out was incredibly difficult, fraught with peril, and generally not recommended for anyone who valued their social standing, their wealth, or their immortal soul. Breaking a betrothal was not like breaking up with someone on Instagram. It carried severe social and financial penalties that could cripple an entire family. You could be sued for breach of contract, which might mean forfeiting vast sums of money or valuable land. You could face social ostracism, branding yourself and your family as unreliable, untrustworthy, and generally unmarriageable in the future. And perhaps most terrifyingly, in a deeply religious age, backing out often carried spiritual damnation. The church viewed betrothal as a sacred promise, a pre-contract to the sacrament of marriage, and breaking it without very, very good cause and papal dispensation was considered a grave sin. So, for all intents and purposes, it was harder to break up with someone you were betrothed to than it was to just go through with the marriage and be miserable for the rest of your natural, plague-shortened life. It was a commitment that truly meant until death do us part, even if death occasionally came in the form of an angry mob or a vengeful ex-fiancé. These formalization ceremonies for betrothal weren't some quick, private conversation. They were often significant public events involving witnesses, legal agreements, and even symbolic rituals. You had hand fasting, where the couple's hands were literally tied together to symbolize their binding union. There was the exchange of rings, often worn on the right hand until the full marriage ceremony. There were solemn oaths sworn before priests and legal documents meticulously drawn up by scribes. This wasn't just a casual promise over a pint. This was an event designed to leave no doubt, no room for retraction, no loophole for cold feet. It was designed to ensure that once you were on the marriage escalator, there was no going back. You were locked in, secured, and destined for your spouse, whether you liked it or not. And chances are, you probably didn't. So, after the terrifyingly binding betrothal, you finally arrive at the main event, the actual wedding ceremony. And if you're picturing a grand, opulent affair reminiscent of a Disney movie, complete with a flowing white dress, a carefully choreographed first dance, and perfectly arranged floral arches, then you, my friend, have once again wandered off into the fantastical meadows of historical inaccuracy. The actual ceremony was, for most people, surprisingly simple and far less elaborate than our modern Pinterest-fueled fantasies. It was primarily a public declaration of the couple's intent to marry, a priest's blessing to sanctify the union, and a communal acknowledgement of the contractual arrangement. Sometimes it happened outside the church doors, sometimes inside. There was no white dress fantasy for the vast majority of medieval brides. White was a color of mourning, and besides, who had money for a single-use garment? Most wore their best, and probably only, dress, likely in a practical, earth-toned hue, perhaps with a touch of embroidery if they were well off. It was functional, it was solemn, and it was certainly not a celebration of true love. The fun part of a medieval wedding was less about celebrating the couple's burgeoning love and romantic connection, and far more about celebrating the strategic joining of families, the consolidation of fortunes, and the securing of alliances. The wedding feast, which we'll get to later, was the true spectacle, a display of wealth and power rather than affection. It was a public affirmation of a pact, witnessed by the community, solidifying the new social and economic arrangements. Guests weren't there to shed a tear at a heartfelt vow. They were there to witness the legal transfer of property, the solemnization of a contract, and to partake in the ensuing feast and merriment, which, let's be honest, was probably the only truly enjoyable part for anyone involved, especially the guests. There were no Pinterest boards in the Middle Ages, just parchment, property deeds, and a collective sense of duty. The underlying sentiment was less hooray for love and more thank goodness that deal is finally sealed. And what about the agency of the bride in all of this? The poor, unfortunate bride. She was often heavily veiled, symbolizing her purity and her passive role in the proceedings. She was literally led to the altar, often by her father or guardian, and presented as a gift, a transfer of property from one male owner to another. Her role was largely symbolic, a beautiful, or at least presentable, vessel, a silent participant in her own fate. She wasn't asked for her opinion, her feelings, or her desires. Her job was to look demure, say the necessary vows, if indeed she was even given a choice in that, and generally behave in a manner that brought honor to her family and promised obedience to her new husband. It was a ceremony of possession, of transfer, of obligation. The only I do that truly mattered was the one spoken by the groom, affirming his acceptance of the package deal. For the bride, it was often an "I'm done for," whispered silently to herself, or perhaps just a grim, stoic acceptance of an inescapable reality. All right, history buffs, gather round, because if you thought the wedding ceremony itself was devoid of romance, you haven't yet plumbed the depths of medieval marital absurdity. Prepare yourselves for the infamous bedding ceremony. Yes, you heard that right. This wasn't some private, intimate moment shared between newlyweds. Oh no, this was a public spectacle. A ritualized invasion of privacy designed to ensure the marriage was properly consecrated and, crucially, to verify the bride's purity and the groom's virility. Imagine, if you dare, your wedding reception winding down, the guests still tipsy on ale and full of roasted boar, and then, in a collective surge of enthusiasm, they all decide to escort you and your new spouse, often half-dressed and giggling, to the marital bed. Sometimes they'd just wait outside the door, hooting and hollering. More often, they'd pile into the room, offering advice, making bawdy jokes, and in some cases, literally standing around or even on the bed just to make sure things got off to a proper and legitimate start. It was the ultimate cringe-inducing public performance. The pressure to perform in this scenario must have been absolutely debilitating. For the groom, it was a public display of potency, a crucial affirmation of his manhood and his ability to fulfill his primary marital duty, procreation. Failure to perform under the watchful eyes and crude jests of his entire family and community would have been a catastrophic blow to his reputation. For the bride, the pressure was arguably even worse.
Her job was to prove her purity, her virginity, a commodity of immense social and legal value. Any signs of prior deflowering or a lack of physical evidence to the contrary could have devastating consequences, potentially invalidating the marriage and bringing immense shame upon her family. Imagine your in-laws live streaming your wedding night, on mute, hopefully, but still watching.
And not just your in-laws, but your uncles, your cousins, your village elders, perhaps even your lord. It was the ultimate reality TV show, but with far higher stakes and absolutely no possibility of a commercial break. The social implications of this ritual were profound and multi-layered. Firstly, it formally and publicly proved the marriage's validity. Consummation was a key component of a binding Christian marriage. Secondly, and perhaps most brutally for the bride, it provided tangible proof of her virginity. In an era where female chastity was prized above almost all other virtues, and the legitimacy of heirs was paramount for inheritance and lineage, visible proof of a bride's purity was deemed essential. It was a public audit of her moral and physical status, a final, definitive stamp of approval, or, horrifyingly, disapproval. And if things went wrong, if there was no evidence of virginity, or if the groom failed to perform, the repercussions were not just social embarrassment. They could lead to annulment, ruin, and deep, lasting shame. So, when you look back at that quaint, romanticized image of a medieval wedding, just remember the clinking of tankards and the lewd jokes echoing down the hall as the happy couple was shoved into their wedding bed, surrounded by a curious, expectant crowd. Romance truly was dead. Congratulations! You survived the bedding ceremony, possibly with your dignity slightly singed but intact. Now, let's talk about the glorious, lifelong contractual obligations that came bundled with your shiny new spouse. For the husband, his rights and duties were clearly delineated, often by centuries of custom, law, and religious doctrine. He was the undisputed head of the household, the legal owner of all property, including his wife's dowry, and theoretically, the provider. He held absolute authority, a miniature king within his own domestic kingdom. His decisions were law, his pronouncements final. He had the right to expect obedience from his wife, to control her movements, to administer reasonable correction, a chilling euphemism for physical discipline, which we'll unpack later, and, of course, to demand conjugal rights. It was a position of immense power, often wielded without much in the way of accountability or tenderness. And for the wife, her duties were even more clearly and restrictively defined. Her primary roles were absolute obedience to her husband, bearing children, preferably male, and many of them, meticulous household management, and unwavering subservience. Her job description was essentially property manager and baby factory, with a side of unquestioning loyalty and a total surrender of personal will. She was expected to manage the servants, oversee the cooking, weaving, and animal husbandry, prepare for harvests, and generally keep the entire domestic engine humming, often with minimal resources and constant pressure. Her intellect and skills were to be employed for the benefit of the household, never for personal ambition. Any deviation from the script was met with severe social censure and, quite possibly, physical rebuke. You were less a partner and more a highly essential, heavily regulated employee in your husband's personal enterprise. This stark division of roles underscored the precarious legal standing of women in medieval society. With very few exceptions, married women had extremely limited legal rights. They were often considered extensions of their husband or father, rather than independent legal entities. They couldn't own property in their own name. Their dowry became their husband's property, though typically earmarked for their eventual dower if they outlived him, couldn't enter into contracts without their husband's permission, and couldn't represent themselves in court. Their legal identity was subsumed by their husbands. A woman's legal agency was, in essence, on permanent sabbatical. It was a world designed by men, for men, with women occupying a subordinate, functional, and largely voiceless role, expected to produce heirs and manage the domestic sphere without complaint. Freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of thought, these were luxuries not afforded to the medieval wife. Let's cut to the chase, shall we? The primary, overriding, non-negotiable purpose of medieval marriage was not romance, not companionship, and certainly not pleasure. It was procreation. Your womb, if you were a woman, was quite literally seen as the kingdom's, your lord's, or your family's asset. It was a vessel, a factory for producing legitimate heirs, laborers, and future generations to secure the family line, work the land, and swell the ranks of the population. Forget candlelight dinners and whispered sweet nothings. Your primary function was population growth, plain and simple. And the sooner you started producing, the better. Any delay was met with anxiety, suspicion, and often rudimentary and rather horrifying attempts at cures for barrenness. It was a constant, relentless pressure, a biological imperative that overshadowed all other aspects of marital life. And shadowing that biological imperative was the ever-present grim reality of high infant and maternal mortality. Each pregnancy was a gamble, a roll of the dice with your own life as the stake. Childbirth was a terrifying, often fatal ordeal, conducted in unsanitary conditions with little medical knowledge. And if you survived, the odds of your child surviving to adulthood were distressingly low. Plague, famine, disease, and general medieval hardiness took a brutal toll on infants and young children. It was a constant, almost expected, cycle of birth and death, a grim rhythm that underscored the fragility of life. You were expected to produce many children, precisely because so many were likely to die young. So, while you were busy producing heirs, you were also constantly mourning, always aware that the joy of a new birth could swiftly turn to the despair of loss. This pressure was particularly intense for male heirs, especially in noble families. A son meant the continuation of the family name, the inheritance of land and titles, the security of the lineage. Daughters were valuable assets for forging alliances through marriage, but ultimately they were temporary residents who would eventually take their dowries to another family. The arrival of only daughters, especially after multiple pregnancies, led to immense disappointment, anxiety, and often marital strain. It drove noble women to serial pregnancies, enduring the physical and emotional toll again and again, hoping for that elusive male heir. Imagine the crushing weight of expectation, the constant fear of failure, the internal despair of giving birth to another healthy girl when what was truly desired was a son. Your body was not your own. It was a biological instrument of the patriarchy, and its success or failure was measured in the gender of its output. All right, so you're married, you're miserable. Your spouse smells like a damp badger. Your children keep dying, And your only reprieve is the occasional feast where you can get gloriously drunk on weak ale. Naturally, your thoughts turn to escape. You start fantasizing about a peaceful, solitary life, maybe in a small cottage, perhaps tending a few chickens, far away from the oppressive reality of your medieval marriage. You ponder, can I get a divorce? And the answer, my dear, is a resounding, soul-crushing, good luck with that, sweetie. Because in the Middle Ages, divorce, as we understand it today, a legal dissolution of a marriage, was strictly prohibited by the church. Like, strictly. The church viewed marriage as a divinely ordained sacrament, a lifelong, indissoluble bond forged by God Himself. You were in it for the long haul, whether you liked it or not. The only way out was something called an annulment. Now, an annulment wasn't a divorce. It didn't end a marriage. It declared that the marriage was never valid in the first place. It was a legal and spiritual sleight of hand, erasing the marriage from existence as if it had never happened. But getting one? That was harder than extracting a tooth with a rusty spoon. You needed to prove that there was a pre-existing impediment to the marriage that rendered it invalid from the outset. Think of it as finding a technicality so obscure, so ancient, so utterly bizarre, that it could retroactively undo a decade of misery. It was an arcane, bureaucratic nightmare, a labyrinth of canon law and ecclesiastical courts that only the most desperate or the most powerful dared to navigate. So, what were these elusive grounds for annulment? Pre-existing impediments. The big ones included consanguinity, meaning you were too closely related, and in an age of intricate family trees and widespread intermarriage among nobility, this was surprisingly common. If you could prove you and your spouse were, say, third cousins once removed, the church might declare the marriage invalid. Other grounds included impotence, the inability of a spouse to consummate the marriage, crucial for procreation, or a prior unconsummated betrothal to someone else. However, proving these things was notoriously difficult. How do you definitively prove impotence? It often involved public inspection, witness testimony, and truly humiliating procedures. It was a humiliating, drawn-out process, and the bar for proof was extraordinarily high. It was, in short, easier to join a monastery or nunnery and commit yourself to a life of quiet piety and celibacy than it was to successfully navigate the medieval annulment process and reclaim your freedom. And who, pray tell, could actually manage to escape this marital cage? Unsurprisingly, it was almost exclusively the wealthy and powerful. The poor? They were stuck. They didn't have the resources, the connections, or the influence to navigate the complex, costly, and politically charged annulment process. A peasant woman married to an abusive drunk? Her recourse was prayer, patience, or running away and hoping not to be caught. For nobles, annulments were often political maneuvers, a way to discard an inconvenient spouse or forge a more advantageous alliance, with the church often amenable to arguments presented by a sufficiently generous patron. So, while you and your badger-smelling spouse were doomed, the King of France might just manage to find a convenient, long-lost, distant cousin that allowed him to dump his barren wife. Justice, medieval style, was a distinctly stratified affair. All right, so divorce is out, annulment is a pipe dream for the elite, and your marriage is, well, it still sucks. But wait, there's a glimmer of hope. Or is there? Let's talk about widowhood, often touted as the medieval woman's brief moment of relative autonomy. And it's true, in a strictly comparative sense, a widow, particularly a wealthy one, often had more legal rights and independence than her married sisters. She might inherit her dower lands, manage her own household, and sometimes even engage in business. For a brief, intoxicating period, she was her own woman, freed from the legal and emotional subjugation of a husband. She could make her own decisions, manage her own affairs, and for perhaps the first time in her life, experience a true taste of individual agency. It was the closest many medieval women ever came to true liberation. However, calling this a silver lining is like calling a particularly shiny storm cloud a silver lining. It was a dark cloud, perhaps with a metallic sheen. This autonomy was often temporary, intensely precarious, and came with its own unique set of pressures. The most immediate and relentless pressure was to remarry. Why? To secure property, for one. If you were a wealthy widow with a sizable estate, you were suddenly a prime target for every land-hungry bachelor and widower in the region. You were, essentially, a walking, talking real estate opportunity to protect your children as well. Without a male protector, children and their inheritance were vulnerable, and for the less wealthy, a husband provided essential labor, protection, and economic security. So, enjoy your freedom, dear widow. It's probably only temporary until the next suitor smells your wealth or your vulnerability and comes knocking, ready to re-subsume you into his household and his legal identity. It was a fleeting taste of independence, often followed by yet another strategic, unromantic union. Furthermore, many widows, particularly those from less affluent backgrounds, faced crippling financial precariousness. While dower rights existed, they weren't always enough to live comfortably, and certainly didn't grant control over the entire family estate, which usually went to the eldest son. Without a husband, a widow might struggle to manage the land, protect her holdings from greedy relatives, or simply provide for herself and her children. Poverty, homelessness, and utter destitution were very real threats. The ideal of the independent widow often applied only to a select, wealthy few. For the vast majority, widowhood was less an opportunity for liberation and more a desperate scramble for survival, often leading them directly back into the arms of another husband, not out of love or desire, but out of sheer, unadulterated necessity. The golden cage might have momentarily opened, but the wilderness outside was often far more terrifying. All right, we've discussed the noble marriages, the land grabbing, the geopolitical chess. Now let's descend from the castles and grand halls into the mud and muck of the peasant's life. If you thought medieval marriage for the aristocracy was a special brand of misery, prepare yourself for a different, yet equally soul-crushing kind of suck. For peasants, marriage wasn't about grand alliances or royal intrigue. It was about raw, brutal survival. It was about combining limited resources, sharing an impossible workload, and producing more hands for the endless toil of the land. There were no dowries in the noble sense. Instead, the bride brought her strength, her skills, her fertility. The bride price was often just a sturdy back, a willing spirit, and the ability to work the land from sun up to sundown, then do it all again tomorrow. Marriage for peasants was, in the purest sense, a practical union. It was a business arrangement, yes, but of a far more immediate and desperate variety. You married to combine fields, to share the crushing burden of labor, to ensure there were enough bodies to plant, harvest, and tend to livestock. It was about pooling meager resources, about creating a viable economic unit, 2 hungry mouths, but also 4 working hands. It was a pragmatic union, not a romantic one.
driven by the stark necessities of subsistence. Did you find your spouse attractive? Irrelevant. Did you have shared hobbies? Unless that hobby was backbreaking agricultural labor, equally irrelevant. Your shared interests were staying alive, avoiding starvation, and hopefully not dying of the plague. Love, in this context, was a frivolous luxury, an emotion that had no place in the relentless struggle for existence. The ceremonies themselves were often simpler, less formal than their noble counterparts, but no less binding and certainly no less filled with obligation. A public declaration, a blessing from the local priest, perhaps a modest feast if the families could afford it, that was often the extent of it. But the commitment was just as inescapable, the vows just as unbreakable. You were still bound for life, still expected to be fruitful and multiply, still expected to obey. The pressures might have been different, less about royal heirs, more about healthy piglets, but the underlying structure of patriarchal control and economic necessity remained firmly in place. Your freedom was still non-existent, your choices still nil. You simply traded the gilded cage of the nobility for the mud-caked, disease-ridden confines of the peasant's hut, and the stink of unwashed bodies and unemptied chamber pots remained, a constant, immersive reminder of your chosen path to misery. Now, before you start thinking that being born into nobility was some kind of gilded ticket to happiness, let's quickly disabuse you of that notion. For noble women, power often came with its own unique, suffocating set of constraints. While they lived in castles and wore fine silks, sometimes, they were paradoxically often less free than peasant women in certain aspects. A peasant woman, while toiling ceaselessly, might have more autonomy in her daily movements and interactions, less scrutiny from watchful eyes. A noble woman, however, was under constant surveillance. Her every move, every interaction, every public appearance was meticulously scrutinized. She was expected to be a paragon of chastity, obedience, and demure grace, yet simultaneously, she was often required to be politically savvy, a skilled manager of large households, and a shrewd negotiator in her husband's absence. It was a tightrope walk over an abyss of social disgrace. Then there were the pressures of court life itself. Imagine a perpetual, high-stakes game of Survivor, but instead of immunity idols, you're vying for favor, influence, and the sheer ability to survive politically. It was a world of intrigue, backstabbing, lavish but incredibly restrictive lifestyles, and constant competition for status and influence. One wrong word, one misstep, one perceived insult, and you could find yourself out of favor, your family disgraced, or worse. Your life was a public performance, and any miscast emotion or unchaperoned conversation could have devastating consequences. The lavish gowns, the jewels, the sumptuous feasts, they were just window dressing for a life lived under an almost unbearable weight of expectation and constant, low-level paranoia. Your closest confidants could be your worst enemies, and your dearest friends could be plotting your downfall. And of course, for noble women, marriages were almost always forced, purely for status, power, or political expediency. Even the highest-born women were mere pawns in a larger game, their personal desires, hopes, and affections ruthlessly sacrificed for family honor or political gain. You might be married to a man you despise, or one who is cruel, or one who is mentally infirm, or simply one who is utterly, completely uninteresting. But you were married to him, and you had to perform your duties, produce heirs, manage his household, and maintain the facade of a harmonious union,
all while potentially yearning for a life you could never have. The gilded cage, indeed. It might have been beautiful, but the bars were steel and the lock was absolutely impenetrable. Your personal life was a public document, and every decision was dictated by the needs of the realm, not the desires of your heart. If you think marrying someone your parents picked for you was bad, imagine having your entire marital life policed by an omnipresent, omniscient, and frankly, often terrifying institution, the church. In medieval Europe, canon law, the law of the church, dictated almost every aspect of marriage. From its validity and sanctity to its prohibitions against certain unions, the church held an iron grip over the institution. It defined who you could marry, no close relatives, not without a hefty dispensation, how you could marry, publicly with witnesses, preferably blessed by a priest, and even what was permissible within the marital bed. God, according to the church, had a very specific opinion on your personal life, and you, dear medieval soul, were expected to adhere to it or face consequences far more dire than social disgrace. And those consequences? Oh, they weren't just about earthly penalties. We're talking about sin and damnation. Breaking marital vows, flouting church rules regarding marriage, or engaging in forbidden practices within the union didn't just make your marriage suck, it meant your immortal soul might suck too, for all eternity. Imagine the constant, low-level anxiety of living in a world where every personal choice, every intimate moment, was potentially a direct affront to God, punishable by everlasting torment. It added a whole new layer of existential dread to an already miserable situation. If you dared to defy the church's strictures, even secretly, you risked not only your social standing, but the very salvation of your soul. It was psychological warfare on a grand scale, ensuring conformity through fear of divine retribution. The church, in its infinite wisdom and insatiable need for control, also employed confession and penance as powerful tools to maintain its grip over private lives. Your confessor wasn't just there to hear your sins, he was often a direct pipeline to the church's authority, asking probing questions about your marital life, your intimate conduct, your obedience to your spouse. He might dictate penance for perceived transgressions, even within the marital bed, defining what was acceptable, what was sinful, and what was simply an abomination. This meant that even your most private moments, your most intimate thoughts, were not truly your own. The church's watchful eye extended even to the bedroom, dictating the rhythms of intimacy, the purposes of procreation, and the limits of physical expression. Your spouse might be annoying, but at least the priest could tell them off, right? No, not really. It was usually just another layer of external control, ensuring that your marital misery was divinely sanctioned and eternally monitored. Let's dive into one of the most stark and, frankly, most horrifying aspects of medieval marriage, the brutal reality of consent, or rather, the utter lack thereof, particularly for women. The historical context of consent, as we understand it today, enthusiastic, ongoing, and freely given, was virtually non-existent in medieval marriage. Once a woman was married, her body was legally, socially, and religiously considered her husband's property. Her will, her desires, her very personhood were subsumed by his. She entered into a contract where her physical autonomy was essentially forfeited. It was a grim transaction, a legal and societal framework that reduced a woman's body to a resource, a vessel, an instrument for her husband's use and for the production of heirs. There was no concept of a woman saying no within a marriage and that no holding any legal weight. This brings us to the truly chilling concept of marital rape. In medieval law and society, marital rape was not a concept that was recognized. It simply did not exist. A wife's body was considered her husband's property, and she had a legal and spiritual duty to sexually obey him, to provide conjugal rights upon his demand. Any refusal was seen as a breach of her marital duties, a transgression against the sacrament of marriage, and potentially grounds for legal complaint from the husband. Imagine the terror, the helplessness, the profound violation of living in a world where your own body was not your own, where your husband had absolute, unquestioned access, and where your pleas, your discomfort, your outright refusal held no legal or social weight whatsoever. Your body was a feudal resource, not your own, and its primary purpose was dictated by the man who owned it. And because the concept of marital rape was unrecognized, there was a profound and terrifying lack of recourse for wives against sexual coercion within marriage. There were no courts she could appeal to, no laws to protect her, no sympathetic ear in the patriarchal structures of the church or state. Her suffering was invisible, unrecognized, and often actively dismissed. The expectation was submission. The reality was often brutal, intimate violation with no hope of justice or escape. This wasn't just about physical discomfort. It was about the complete erasure of a woman's bodily autonomy, her right to self-determination, and her fundamental human dignity within the supposed sanctity of marriage. It's a stark, dark truth that should make anyone grateful for the slow and agonizing progress made towards recognizing and protecting individual consent in modern times. In the Middle Ages, the wedding vows weren't just about giving your heart, they were about surrendering your entire physical being. All right, let's talk about the inevitable outcome of all this marital misery: children. Lots and lots of children. For most married women in the Middle Ages, the constant cycle of pregnancy and childbirth was not just a possibility, it was the relentless, all-consuming norm. Marriages often began young, sometimes barely out of childhood, and the expectation was immediate and continuous procreation. You were pregnant, nursing, pregnant again, often without much pause, for the entirety of your fertile years, until your body simply gave out. It was a physically grueling, emotionally draining, and incredibly dangerous existence. Your life became a relentless cycle of gestation, birth, and recovery, always with the grim specter of high mortality rates looming over every single pregnancy. Speaking of mortality rates, let's not sugarcoat it. High infant mortality was a constant, devastating reality. Expecting to lose several, if not most, of your children was a grim, heartbreaking expectation. You'd give birth, sometimes after an agonizing days-long labor, and then you'd cross your fingers, pray to every saint in the calendar, and hope that this fragile, tiny life would somehow survive the first few days, the first winter, the next epidemic of plague or dysentery. Naming your kids was a risk. You might grow attached. It was often safer, emotionally, to hold back a piece of your heart because the odds were so heavily stacked against them. The joy of a new birth was almost immediately tempered by the profound anxiety of potential loss. Imagine the emotional toll, the constant heartbreak, the sheer resilience required to keep going in the face of such relentless tragedy. Despite the heartbreak, Children were also viewed, quite pragmatically, as economic assets. They were more hands for the farm, more laborers for the household, heirs for the estate, and an investment in the future. For peasant families, more children meant more labor, and thus a better chance of survival. For noble families, a son meant the continuation of the lineage, the security of the lands, the family name carried forward. Each birth was not just a personal event, but an economic calculation, a strategic move. Your worth as a wife was often measured by your ability to produce surviving children, particularly sons. So, your womb was an economic engine, your children were its output, and your emotional attachment was a complicated, often painful byproduct of this brutal reality. The fruits of your labor were indeed children, but they were often the fruits of joyless, desperate, and tragically impermanent labor. All right, so you're married, you're producing children who may or may not survive, and your days are filled with relentless obligation. But what about the day-to-day? What's it like to actually live with your medieval spouse?
Prepare yourself for a lifetime of unromantic roommates, because that's often what it boiled down to. For women, especially, daily life was an unending cycle of domestic drudgery. Wives managed households, which, even for modest peasant homes, were often large, complex, and incredibly demanding.
From cooking over an open fire that perpetually filled the room with acrid smoke, to weaving cloth for clothing, to preserving food for winter, to tending to animals, to fetching water, to mending, cleaning, and raising children, the labor was constant and exhaustive, with minimal help and ancient, inefficient tools. It was a never-ending to-do list, performed under the ever-present threat of disease, famine, and the general discomforts of medieval life. And forget about personal space or privacy. The concept simply did not exist. Medieval living conditions were universally crowded. Peasant families often lived in one- or two-room hovels, sharing beds with multiple family members, or even with their animals during colder months for warmth.
Even in larger manor houses or castles, privacy was a luxury of the extremely wealthy, and even then it was limited. Imagine trying to have a private conversation when your children, your servants, and possibly your extended family are all within earshot. There was no concept of a private moment, no quiet retreat, no locked door to escape to. You lived, ate, slept, and performed all bodily functions in close proximity to everyone else.
The constant noise, the lingering smells, the sheer lack of personal boundaries would be enough to drive most modern individuals utterly mad. Your intimacy was often performed under the metaphorical and sometimes literal gaze of a dozen other people. This ubiquitous lack of privacy extended to, and arguably contributed to, the often profound lack of emotional intimacy in medieval marriages. Emotional connection, romantic love, deep personal understanding, these were not societal priorities. Practical partnership, the efficient running of a household, and the production of heirs were the goals. Your spouse was a coworker, a fellow laborer, a necessary component in the machinery of survival, not necessarily a confidant or a soulmate. There was little space or time for the cultivation of deep emotional bonds, and even less societal expectation for them. Your intimacy was physical, functional, and often public, rather than emotional or deeply personal. You are bound together by law, religion, and necessity, but not necessarily by affection. It was a partnership of endurance, not of romance, a lifetime spent with an unromantic roommate, perpetually underfoot and perpetually in your business. Let's venture into the bedroom once more, shall we? Because even in the most unromantic of unions, certain expectations had to be met. And when it came to medieval marriage, the sexual expectations were predominantly, overwhelmingly, and explicitly centered around the husband's needs. The wife had a clear, undeniable duty to provide sex, or conjugal rights, to her husband upon his demand. Denial of these rights, without extremely compelling reasons, like the husband being abroad for an extended period or physical illness, could be grounds for marital dispute or even legal action by the husband. It wasn't about mutual desire or pleasure. It was a right of the husband and an obligation of the wife. Her body, once again, was a resource, and its sexual function was primarily to satisfy her husband's demands and, crucially, to procreate. Refusal was a serious breach of contract. This led to a glaring, utterly predictable double standard. Husbands had needs, physical urges deemed natural and largely uncontrollable, which society and the church largely accommodated. Wives, on the other hand, were expected to be modest, chaste, and sexually passive. Their needs, if they were even acknowledged, were considered secondary, less urgent, and often sinful outside of the context of procreation. A man's lust was a fact of nature. A woman's desire was a potential gateway to sin and temptation. This imbalance created a deeply unfair and often oppressive sexual dynamic within marriage, where the wife's consent was implied by the marriage vows, and her physical autonomy was largely disregarded. It was a one-sided equation, where one party's desires were paramount, and the others were to be suppressed or merely tolerated for the sake of marital duty. Adding another layer of absurdity to this whole arrangement were the prevalent medical beliefs of the time, often rooted in ancient Greek and Roman thought. There were widespread misconceptions about female orgasm and conception, often framing it as necessary for conception. This added even more pressure on the wife, not just to submit, but potentially to perform in a way that ensured conception, regardless of her own comfort or pleasure. The idea was that the female seed, often thought to be released during orgasm, was necessary for the child to be properly formed. So not only did you have to endure unwanted intimacy, but you also had the added burden of ensuring you achieved some form of physical response to make sure you successfully conceived. It was a bizarre blend of biological misunderstanding, patriarchal control, and the constant, relentless drive for procreation. Truly, the medieval marital bed was less a place of loving embrace and more a crucible of duty, obligation, and often profound discomfort. All right, so you're stuck in a marital arrangement that prioritizes duty over delight, and the bedroom is more about obligation than ardor. What happens if someone steps outside these rigid boundaries? Well, let's talk about infidelity, because here the medieval double standard wasn't just double, it was practically a quadruple standard, wrapped in barbed wire and dipped in sulfuric acid. For men, particularly noblemen, concubines and mistresses were often tolerated, sometimes even openly acknowledged, as long as they didn't threaten the legitimacy of the primary lineage. A lord might have his official wife to produce heirs and manage his household, and a mistress or two on the side to provide companionship, pleasure, or simply distraction. As long as these dalliances didn't produce rival heirs or cause a scandalous public spectacle that undermined the marital contract, they were frequently overlooked, or at least quietly accepted. He could have a side quest. You just had a side eye and a profound sense of resignation. For women, however, adultery was an entirely different beast. It was not merely a transgression, it was a severe crime, a mortal sin, and an unforgivable betrayal that could shatter her life, her family, and her very soul. The consequences were brutal. Public shaming, repudiation by her husband, loss of her dowry, disinheritance of her children, whose legitimacy would be forever questioned, and in some regions, it could even lead to physical mutilation or death. Imagine being dragged through the village streets, hair shorn, face branded, before being cast out into destitution, all because you sought solace or affection outside the brutal confines of your arranged marriage. Her infidelity struck at the heart of the patriarchal system, threatening the purity of the bloodline, the security of inheritance, and the very foundation of male control. It was an attack on the social order, and it was punished with terrifying severity. And the children born out of these illicit unions? Again, a stark and cruel double standard. Children born out of wedlock to men, particularly noblemen, might be acknowledged, sometimes even given a modest inheritance or a place in the household, though they could never inherit the primary title or lands. They might be called bastards, but their existence was often tolerated, sometimes even an open secret. For women, however, children born out of wedlock were social outcasts, their mothers often ruined and cast out, forced to fend for themselves and their illegitimate offspring in a profoundly unforgiving world. These children carried the stigma of their birth throughout their lives, forever marked as products of sin and shame. So, while a man's illicit pleasures might result in a few extra mouths to feed, and perhaps a bit of gossip, a woman's sin could lead to utter ruin, social death, and the complete destruction of her and her children's future. It was a perilous game, and the rules were brutally, unfairly stacked. Given the grim realities of medieval marriage, it's hardly surprising that people sometimes desperately sought escape. But in a society so rigidly structured by law, custom, and the ever-present grip of the church, options were few, perilous, and often only accessible to a select few. One of the few sanctioned escapes, particularly for women, was joining a convent or a monastery. For a woman, it offered a life of intellectual pursuits, spiritual devotion, and a degree of autonomy and community that marriage simply couldn't provide. For a man, the monastery offered scholarship, peace, or simply a way to avoid the pressures of inheritance and procreation. However, this wasn't usually a spontaneous decision. Often, entering a religious order was pre-arranged by the family, especially for younger daughters who couldn't be suitably married off, or for sons not destined for inheritance. It was less an act of personal rebellion and more a rerouting of your destiny, albeit to a slightly different form of lifelong commitment. Then there was the far riskier, far more romanticized, and usually far more tragic path of elopement and forbidden love. Imagine two young lovers defying their families, risking everything for a chance at happiness, galloping off into the sunset. Sounds thrilling, right? In reality, it rarely ended well. Elopement, especially if not sanctioned by the church or family, carried severe social stigma, legal penalties, and often utter destitution. You'd lose your family's support, your inheritance, and your social standing. If caught, you might face forced marriage to the originally intended spouse, imprisonment, or worse. The church might refuse to marry you, leaving your union unsanctified and your children illegitimate. These stories of forbidden love were usually just that, stories, fictionalized tragedies designed to entertain, not to reflect a common reality. Most sensible people knew that defying the social order in such a profound way was a fast track to ruin, not romance. Finally, we come to the most desperate, most futile, and most heartbreaking act of control a woman might attempt: defiance through barrenness. In an era where a woman's worth was so intrinsically tied to her ability to produce heirs, particularly male ones, a desperate few might have hoped that their inability to conceive would somehow render their unwanted marriage irrelevant. If there were no children, no heirs, then perhaps the very purpose of the union would be nullified, offering some sliver of hope for escape or freedom. This was, of course, a desperate, often unconscious act of psychological self-preservation and almost entirely futile. Barrenness was far more likely to lead to anxiety, attempts at annulment by the husband, or the husband simply taking a mistress or seeking another wife, rather than granting the woman any liberation. It was a tragic, silent scream for agency in a world that allowed none, a profound act of desperation in the face of an inescapable fate. Now, lest you think that all medieval misery was cut from the exact same cloth, it's worth noting that Europe, even in its less enlightened times, was a vast patchwork of different customs, laws, and traditions. So while the overarching theme of marriage sucks remained universally true, there were, shall we say, different flavors of unhappiness across the continent. Take Scandinavia, for instance. In some areas, particularly among the Norse, women historically enjoyed somewhat more equitable rights compared to their counterparts further south. They might have more control over their dowries, often called mourning gifts, the ability to initiate divorce, though still difficult, and some influence in household decisions. But don't go packing your bags for a Viking wedding just yet. These were relative freedoms, still operating within a fiercely patriarchal society where physical labor, the ever-present threat of violence, and the demands of clan survival still heavily dictated life. You might have more say in who you married, but you were still probably sharing a longhouse with 3 generations of relatives and their livestock. Then swing south to Italy, particularly the burgeoning urban centers. Here, a stronger urban economy meant more sophisticated financial arrangements. Dowry systems were incredibly strong, often a massive component of a family's wealth, and a critical investment in their social mobility. Marriage contracts could be incredibly detailed, almost like complex corporate mergers, outlining every possible financial permutation. Women in powerful merchant families might wield significant indirect influence, managing vast estates in their husband's absence, or acting as crucial social connectors. However, this economic power often came with even tighter social restrictions. They were confined to the domestic sphere, expected to be meticulously chaste and demure, with their reputations constantly under scrutiny. So you might have a massive dowry and a beautiful palazzo, but you also had less personal freedom and probably spent your days worried about rival families and the purity of your children's bloodline. Move east, and you encounter different feudal structures and traditions. In parts of Eastern Europe, local customs blended with Orthodox Christian traditions, sometimes leading to unique forms of marriage and family life. The influence of Byzantine law might mean slightly different inheritance patterns, or a different emphasis on certain familial roles. However, despite these regional nuances, the overarching themes of suckiness remained stubbornly consistent. Limited individual agency, particularly for women, remained paramount. The economic focus of marriage, whether it was about land, labor, or intricate dowries, persisted as the primary driver. And patriarchal dominance, with men holding ultimate authority and women primarily relegated to domestic and reproductive roles, was the universal constant. So, while the specific misery might vary slightly from a frigid Scandinavian longhouse to a bustling Italian palazzo, the fundamental reality of an unromantic, obligatory, and often deeply unhappy medieval marriage was an inescapable truth across the continent. All right, prepare yourselves, because we're about to delve into the truly immersive, truly pungent realities of medieval marital intimacy. You think your partner leaving a damp towel on the bed is annoying? Imagine trying to cultivate any kind of romance when both of you perpetually smell like a poorly managed compost heap and your breath could peel paint off a wall. Because, let's be blunt, general lack of hygiene was a defining characteristic of the age. Bathing was infrequent, often seen as a medical indulgence rather than a daily necessity, and for many, a luxury they couldn't afford anyway. Body odors were strong, pervasive, and utterly unavoidable. Your spouse smelled like a barn, and so did you, constantly, and probably everyone else in the house, the village, and the entire continent. Masking this with the occasional bunch of herbs or a dab of expensive perfume, if you were noble, was a losing battle against the relentless tide of medieval funk. And if the olfactory assault wasn't enough, consider the ever-present threat of disease and contagion. You're sharing bodily fluids in an age before anyone understood germs. Plague, smallpox, dysentery, consumption, various fevers. These weren't historical footnotes. They were daily, terrifying realities. Marital intimacy was a high-risk activity, not just for potential pregnancy, but for the easy transmission of whatever delightful ailment your partner had picked up from the communal well or the latest sick animal. Every cough, every sneeze, every rash was a potential death sentence. Imagine trying to be intimate when the logical part of your brain is screaming, "This person might literally kill you with their breath." It added a grim, often fatal, layer of Russian roulette to an already unappealing proposition. Your wedding vows probably should have included "in sickness and in potential, highly contagious, gruesome death." And speaking of sickness, let's not forget medieval medicine. Or rather, the terrifying lack thereof. If your marital woes extended to reproductive issues, or if you simply fell ill from the inevitable contagion, the remedies were often more horrific than the ailment itself. Bloodletting, purgatives, leeches, bizarre herbal concoctions that probably tasted like boiled socks, and superstitious rituals were the order of the day. A woman struggling with conception might be subjected to invasive, painful, and utterly ineffective cures that did more harm than good. Imagine being told you need to rub some obscure animal part on yourself or drink a vile-smelling potion, all to fulfill your marital duty. It was a world of profound ignorance and casual brutality, where your personal discomfort was irrelevant, and your body was merely a canvas for horrifying, unproven interventions. So, yeah, the smells were bad, the diseases were worse, and the cures were often a final insult to an already suffering existence. Sleep tight. All right, after all that talk of hygiene and disease, let's finally get to one of the few genuinely joyous aspects of a medieval wedding: the feast. Yes, for the wealthy at least, this was often a lavish, multi-day extravaganza, a glorious reprieve from the grinding misery of daily life. This was the moment the families displayed their wealth, their status, their generosity. Imagine overflowing tables laden with roasted meats, boar, venison, swan, peacock feathers and all for spectacle. Imagine savory pies, rich stews, sweet pastries, and copious amounts of fresh, if seasonally limited, produce. The air would be thick with the smells of roasting fat, spices, and unwashed bodies, yes, but also the intoxicating aroma of celebration. Music would play, minstrels would entertain, and jugglers or acrobats might perform. It was a spectacle of sensory overload, a glorious, decadent explosion of food, drink, and merriment. And the food and drink. Oh, the sheer volume. For the nobility, it was a chance to indulge in exotic spices brought from afar, to demonstrate their connections and their wealth. Ale and wine would flow freely, often unwatered, leading to widespread drunkenness and boisterous revelry. It was a chance to eat your fill, to truly gorge yourself, in an era where food scarcity was a constant threat. Imagine the sheer delight of a peasant invited to partake in the noble's feast, getting to taste meat that wasn't primarily salted or smoked, to drink ale that wasn't watered down.
It was a rare, precious opportunity for communal celebration, for forgetting the harsh realities of life for a brief, blissful period. The clatter of plates, the laughter, the raucous songs, these were the precious moments of unadulterated joy in an otherwise somber existence. But, as with all things medieval, this happiness was incredibly short-lived.
This magnificent feast was a temporary reprieve, a fleeting moment of joyous excess, soon to be replaced by the grim, unromantic reality awaiting the newlyweds. The next day, or perhaps the day after, the guests would disperse, the tables would be cleared, and the couple would be left to face their new life together, a life of duty, obligation, and the distinct lack of opulent feasts. The rich, savory smells would fade, replaced by the familiar stench of daily existence. The laughter would die down, replaced by the mundane sounds of household chores. It was a brief, tantalizing glimpse of luxury before being plunged back into the familiar, uncomfortable rhythm of medieval matrimony. The wedding feast was one good meal before a lifetime of bland, both gastronomically and emotionally. Enjoy it while you can, because it's probably the last genuinely good time you're going to have for a very, very long time. So, the feast is over, the hangover is setting in, and you, the bride, are now facing the next great trauma, the journey to your husband's home. For many medieval brides, this was often a traumatic and permanent separation from their birth family. You were literally leaving everything and everyone familiar behind. Your village, your parents, your siblings, your childhood friends, the comforting rhythms of your upbringing, all were suddenly ripped away. You were moving to a new village, a new estate, a new region, sometimes hundreds of miles away, to a world where you knew no one and nothing. This wasn't just a move. It was a profound severing, a relocation of resignation. There were no cell phones for quick calls home, no social media to keep up with old friends. Once you left, you were often gone for good, a ghost in the memories of those you left behind. Upon arrival, you entered a stranger's home, often with new customs, new traditions, and an entirely new social hierarchy, where you, the newcomer, were definitively at the bottom. You were the interloper, the outsider, the foreign element. You had to learn the local dialect, if it was significantly different, adapt to unfamiliar foods, and navigate the intricate social dynamics of an established household that had been running perfectly fine without you. You were expected to assimilate, to become part of his family, to erase your former identity and embrace your new one, all while under the watchful, often critical, eye of your new in-laws and servants. It was less a welcoming embrace and more a forced integration, a rapid immersion into a world where you had to quickly find your footing or risk being ostracized. This journey and the subsequent integration often led to profound loneliness and isolation, especially for noble women sent far away to solidify political alliances. Imagine being a young girl, ripped from your family, sent to a foreign court where you don't speak the language, don't understand the customs, and are surrounded by people who view you as a strategic asset, not a person. You might be surrounded by servants, but none are truly friends. You're physically present, but emotionally utterly alone, without familiar faces or comforting voices. This wasn't just about missing your mom. It was about a fundamental loss of identity, a constant feeling of being an alien in your own life. The magnificent castle might be impressive, but its thick walls and echoing halls would only amplify the profound sense of isolation, a constant reminder that you were a stranger in a strange land, married to a man you barely knew, all for the sake of political expediency. Just when you thought your medieval marital misery couldn't get any worse, let me introduce you to your new eternal tormentors, the in-laws. Oh yes, forget modern sitcom tropes about mildly annoying mother-in-laws. In the Middle Ages, your mother-in-law was often the true, formidable power in the household, particularly in the early years of your marriage. She was the queen bee, the matriarch, the one who had run the household for decades, and she was likely not thrilled to see some young, inexperienced upstart, you, arrive to potentially disrupt her carefully ordered domain. She dictated household affairs, managed the servants, controlled the keys to the storerooms, and generally held sway over everything from the evening meal to the education of her grandchildren. You were, effectively, her subordinate, expected to learn from her, obey her, and never, ever question her authority. Your integration into this new family was less about being welcomed with open arms and more about demands, expectations, and often a complete loss of individual identity. You were no longer just you were now part of his family, a satellite orbiting their established sun. Your opinions were secondary, your preferences irrelevant. You were expected to adopt their customs, their way of doing things, and to quietly conform to their expectations. Any attempt to assert your own individuality, to suggest a different way of cooking the stew or managing the flax, would likely be met with disapproval, a sharp tongue, or a withering glare. It was a constant psychological battle for a shred of autonomy, a fight you were almost guaranteed to lose. The dynamics of medieval family life were brutal, often requiring the bride to completely submit to her new kin. You weren't just marrying a man, you were marrying his entire family, his traditions, his history, and his mother's iron will. Conflicts were inevitable, but your position in them was clear: submission. You had to learn to navigate the intricate web of family alliances, rivalries, and personalities, all while maintaining a facade of respectful obedience. Your husband, likely beholden to his own mother, might offer little support or actively side with his family against you. It was a profound test of mental fortitude, a constant barrage of unspoken expectations and subtle power plays. So, yes, while you might have escaped your own parents, you often simply traded one set of parental authorities for another, far more formidable and far less sympathetic set of in-laws. Good luck finding a moment's peace. Let's talk about the existential dread of medieval women, filtered through the lens of inheritance and succession. In an overwhelmingly patrilineal system, the overwhelming importance of male heirs for land, titles, and lineage was the bedrock of society. Daughters were valuable, yes, but primarily as temporary assets for forging alliances through marriage, their worth ultimately measured by the dowry they brought and the strategic advantage they offered. But ultimately, they were temporary. They married out, taking their dowry with them, and their children carried their husband's name, not their birth families. The true, lasting importance, the weight of dynastic continuity, rested squarely on the shoulders of sons. No sons, no line. No line, no power, no future. This, of course, reduced the wife's role to that of a vessel. Her primary function, her raison d'être, was to ensure the continuation of the husband's lineage, not her own. Her body was the biological conduit through which the husband's bloodline, his name, his property, would pass to the next generation. Her fertility was paramount. Her personal identity, her thoughts, her feelings were utterly secondary to this biological imperative. If she failed to produce a male heir, especially after multiple pregnancies, her worth plummeted, her position became precarious, and her husband might begin to look for ways to annul the marriage or seek alternative solutions. It was a relentless, dehumanizing pressure, a constant reminder that her value was tied almost solely to her reproductive capabilities. Now, we've mentioned dower or jointure before, what a widow received to support herself. And while this offered a modicum of security, it's crucial to understand it was about support, not control of the main inheritance. The vast majority of the family estate, the primary land, the titles, the wealth, typically passed directly to the eldest son, or failing that, to another male relative. The widow might live off the income from her dower lands, but she generally couldn't sell them, bequeath them as she wished, or make major decisions about the main family wealth. Her financial independence was limited, and her role as a landholder was often just temporary stewardship. So, while you might have existed within the marriage, your existence truly mattered primarily as a means to an end, to secure and perpetuate your husband's line, ensuring his legacy, not yours, would endure. Your own name would vanish. His would echo through the generations, thanks to your reproductive efforts. By now, you're probably convinced that love match and medieval marriage are two phrases that belong in separate galaxies. And you'd be largely correct. However, like finding a particularly shiny piece of quartz in a gravel pit, there were exceedingly rare instances of something resembling a love marriage in the Middle Ages. These were, however, the mythical unicorns of the era, the exceptions that proved the rule. They were more likely to occur among the lower classes, where economic necessity might occasionally align with personal affection, or later in the period, as societal norms slowly, and I mean slowly, began to shift. Sometimes parental consent might even be granted, but often only after the initial infatuation had been thoroughly vetted against economic and social practicalities, and often after a good deal of parental coercion. It was less about passionate love and more about, fine, you two seem less likely to starve together than apart, and they have a decent plot of land. The very nature of such unions was subversive, going against the societal grain, defying the expected norm of strategic, arranged marriages, often led to social ostracization or, for the more well-to-do, disinheritance. If you dared to marry for love without your family's explicit and enthusiastic approval, you could be cut off, stripped of your inheritance, and cast out into a world that had little sympathy for such emotional folly. It was a radical act, a rebellion against the very foundations of medieval social order, and it came with incredibly high risks. You weren't just defying your parents. You were challenging an entire system designed to prioritize family, lineage, and property over fleeting personal affections. The consequences for such romantic audacity could be lifelong poverty and social ruin. And let's not forget that even the romantic exceptions we often hear about are usually fictionalized in literature and songs. Think Lancelot and Guinevere, a story of epic, tragic, illicit love that ultimately ended in scandal, the downfall of a kingdom, and widespread misery. Not exactly a shining example of marital bliss, is it? These tales were escapist fantasies, precisely because they depicted a kind of love that was so utterly divorced from the grim realities of daily medieval life. They were a projection of desires that could rarely be fulfilled, a yearning for an emotional connection that was generally not permitted within the confines of matrimony. So, while the troubadours sang of undying love and passionate devotion, the vast majority of people were busy trying to scrape by with their pre-assigned, unbathed spouses and dreaming of a world where maybe, just maybe, their feelings actually mattered. Spoiler, they didn't. All right, we've established that medieval marriage was a minefield of misery. But what happens when things went really wrong? Beyond the general suckiness, what were the truly dark corners of this institution? Let's start with spousal abuse. It was common, and worse, it was often legally sanctioned. The concept of a husband's reasonable correction of his wife was enshrined in custom and sometimes even law. A man was considered the head of his household, and his wife, like his children or servants, was under his authority. Physical discipline was often seen as a legitimate means of maintaining order, enforcing obedience, and correcting perceived transgressions. There was no legal recourse for women. A wife beaten by her husband would find little sympathy from the authorities, who would likely see it as a private domestic matter, perfectly within the husband's rights. Imagine living in a world where your own home could be a place of sanctioned violence, and you had absolutely no legal protection or avenue for escape. Then there was abandonment. While a wife couldn't easily divorce her husband, a husband, especially a poorer one, could simply leave his wife and children. He might wander off in search of work, join a mercenary band, or just disappear, often with little to no legal consequence for himself. This left the abandoned wife in an utterly destitute and precarious position. Without a husband's labor or protection, she and her children faced immediate poverty, homelessness, and the grim prospect of starvation. She might be forced into begging, prostitution, or other desperate measures to survive. There were few social safety nets, and her community,
while perhaps offering some temporary charity, often had little long-term support to give. It was a harsh, unforgiving world, and a woman abandoned by her husband was essentially left to face it alone, with all the odds stacked against her. And finally, a rare but legally significant reason for annulment: impotence. Given the paramount importance of procreation in medieval marriage, a husband's inability to consummate the marriage due to physical impotence could be a valid ground for annulment. This was a direct threat to the very purpose of marriage, the production of legitimate heirs. However, as you can imagine, proving impotence was notoriously difficult and profoundly humiliating. It often involved the husband being subjected to public examinations, and the wife having to testify about the intimate details of their private life. Imagine the indignity, the shame, the sheer absurdity of having to publicly discuss your husband's bedroom failures in front of a panel of stern-faced clerics and gossiping neighbors. It was a testament to how crucial procreation was that such a deeply private matter was dragged into the public sphere, a desperate attempt to rectify a biological failure that threatened the sacred purpose of the marital bond. So, your first medieval marriage was a spectacular train wreck, but you, by some miracle, survived. Perhaps your spouse succumbed to the plague, or fell off a horse, or was simply eaten by wolves. One can dream. Now you're a widow or a widower. Surely a second chance at happiness. Don't be ridiculous. The second marriage in medieval times was often double the trouble, and with even less hope for personal fulfillment. Widowers and widows often remarried quickly, not out of passion or desire, but for intensely practical reasons. For a widower, he needed someone to manage his household, care for his existing children, and of course, provide more heirs. For a widow, particularly one with land or children, remarriage was a desperate necessity for protection, labor, and economic security. It was a pragmatic reassessment of assets and needs, a cold calculation of utility rather than affection. These second marriages came with a fresh set of complex challenges. Stepchildren, for instance. You might inherit a whole brood of unruly, resentful children from your new spouse's previous marriage, who might view you as an unwanted intruder or a threat to their own inheritance. Combining households meant merging two potentially very different ways of life, two sets of servants, two collections of personal belongings, and often two sets of traditions that might clash spectacularly. And then there were the complex inheritances. Whose children got what land? How were the dowries from the previous marriages handled? These were logistical nightmares that could lead to bitter family disputes, lawsuits, and lifelong animosity. It wasn't just two people joining, it was two entire families with all their baggage suddenly trying to coexist. Unsurprisingly, second marriages were often even less romantic and far more overtly transactional than first marriages. The illusion of youthful love, however faint, had long since faded. The focus was squarely on necessity: managing land, securing labor, combining resources, and providing for existing children. There was little pretense of romantic affection. It was a pure business arrangement, often entered into with a grim, weary resignation. You knew what you were getting into. You understood the stakes. You accepted the inherent misery as part of the deal. So, while a second marriage offered a second chance at survival and stability, it rarely offered a second chance at happiness. It was simply a different, perhaps slightly more experienced, flavor of medieval marital suck,
entered into with a heavy sigh and a profound understanding that this was simply how things were. So, you've heard all about the horrors of medieval marriage and thought, perhaps I'll just skip that whole charade? Well, my friend, preparing for a life unmarried in the Middle Ages was akin to preparing for a life of professional solitude and probable social ostracization. The social pressure to marry was immense and inescapable. Unmarried adults, particularly women, faced significant stigma, economic hardship, and were seen as incomplete, unfulfilled, and often suspiciously deviant. An unmarried woman, an old maid, was a financial burden on her family, a wasted reproductive resource, and a subject of endless gossip and pity. An unmarried man might fare slightly better, but he too would be seen as failing in his societal duties to produce heirs and uphold his family's lineage. Society simply wasn't set up for solo acts. However, there were sanctioned alternatives, albeit highly specific ones: convents and monasteries. For women, entering a convent offered a pathway to education, spiritual fulfillment, a sense of community, and a degree of intellectual and personal autonomy that was simply unavailable in marriage. For men, a monastery offered scholarship, contemplation, or simply an escape from the brutal demands of feudal life, military service, or forced marriage. It was a different kind of commitment, a lifelong vow of celibacy and devotion, but it was a path that offered purpose and a structured alternative to the domestic sphere. It wasn't freedom in the modern sense, but it was a choice, albeit a limited one, to dedicate one's life to God rather than to a husband or family. But for those who couldn't or wouldn't take religious vows, the fate of the old maid was grim. This stereotype was a fate to be avoided at all costs for women, symbolizing worthlessness, failure, and a perpetual state of dependence. Without a husband, a woman had no legal standing, no means of support, and often no social respect. She was reliant on the charity of her family, forced to live in the shadow of her married sisters, and constantly reminded of her failure to fulfill her primary societal purpose. It was a life of quiet desperation, profound loneliness, and often grinding poverty. So, while choosing to remain unmarried in the Middle Ages might have spared you the indignities of a forced union, it traded one set of miseries for another, arguably equally bleak existence. Sometimes, it seemed, there truly was no escape. After cataloging the relentless misery of medieval marriage, you might be asking yourself, how did they do it? How did these poor souls manage to endure a lifetime of unchosen spouses, constant danger, crushing expectations, and profound lack of personal agency without simply succumbing to despair or, going utterly mad? The answer lies in a cocktail of coping mechanisms, all steeped in the brutal realities of their era. Resignation was key. Personal happiness was not a primary goal. Enduring hardship was a virtue, and acceptance of one's lot in life was preached from pulpits and ingrained from birth. Unwavering faith provided solace, offering hope of a better afterlife, a reward for earthly suffering. Focus on children, however many died, gave purpose, and small, quiet acts of rebellion, moments of solace in community, might have offered brief respites. The mindset of acceptance was pervasive. This was a world where personal happiness was simply not a primary goal, not an expectation. Life was hard, brutal, and short. Enduring hardship, performing one's duties, and accepting one's fate were seen as virtues, not failures. You didn't expect to be happy. You expected to survive, to fulfill your role, to perhaps find a quiet moment of peace amidst the chaos.
It was a world that prioritized the collective over the individual, duty over desire, and spiritual salvation over earthly contentment. So while we might view their lives as tragically unfulfilled, they might have simply seen it as life. This leads to a question that often plagues modern minds when looking at history. Was it stoicism or stupidity? How did they manage to survive it all without the benefit of therapy, basic ibuprofen, or even the concept of individual rights? Part of it was certainly stoicism, a grim determination to endure, a deep well of resilience born from constant exposure to hardship. Part of it was simply a lack of alternatives, an inability to even conceive of a different way of living, and perhaps a touch of blissful ignorance. They didn't know what they were missing. They didn't have the internet to show them carefully curated images of idyllic, romantic unions. Their frame of reference was simply, this is how it is. So, while we recoil in horror, they simply persevered, fueled by faith, duty, and a profound collective ability to just keep going, one miserable, unhygienic, unromantic day at a time. It's a testament to the human spirit, or perhaps just to a very strong survival instinct. All right, my weary travelers through the annals of marital misery. Let's take a deep breath and quickly recap the key suck factors of getting hitched in the Middle Ages. You had no choice in your partner, none whatsoever. Your destiny decided by parents, lords, and property deeds. There was no concept of consent as we understand it, particularly for women, whose bodies were treated as marital property. Romantic love was a mythical unicorn, utterly divorced from the pragmatic realities of marriage. You faced constant danger from disease, childbirth, and general medieval hardiness. Your existence was an economic burden and a reproductive imperative. And let's not forget the public humiliation. From the bedding ceremony to the constant surveillance of your every move. It was a relentless assault on personal autonomy, dignity, and any shred of individual happiness. Now, let's contrast that with the glorious, often infuriating reality of modern marriage. You get to choose your partner. Imagine the sheer audacity. You swipe, you date, you reject, you choose based on personal attraction, shared values, and mutual affection. Equality, at least in theory, is a foundational principle, with laws protecting both spouses. Romantic love is considered the very bedrock of a successful union, not a scandalous side project. Personal autonomy is a celebrated right, with individuals having control over their bodies, their choices, and their futures. We have therapy, contraceptives, modern medicine, and the ability to escape truly toxic situations. Your biggest marital worry might be who's loading the dishwasher, not who's going to die of dysentery or be forced into public consummation. So, next time your dating app is glitchy, or you're stuck on a particularly boring first date that feels like a waste of your precious modern time, or your spouse forgets to take out the trash again, take a moment. Take a deep, grateful sigh. And remember what medieval folks went through. Remember the smells, the dirt, the disease, the lack of choice, the constant fear, the public humiliation, the sheer unrelenting misery of it all. You've got it easy. Seriously. You have the freedom to choose, to leave, to expect respect, to pursue personal happiness. You can bathe whenever you want. You don't have to worry about a knight in rusty armor breaking down your door to enforce a marriage contract. So maybe, just maybe, send a silent thank you to your ancestors who endured such profound, relentless suckage so you don't have to. Well, there you have it, folks.
A journey through the glorious, unromantic, deeply unsettling reality of medieval marriage. We've seen that it wasn't about I do, but I'm done for. It wasn't about hearts and flowers, it was about land deeds and livestock. It was a contractual obligation, a desperate gamble against disease and death, and a lifetime spent with someone you didn't choose, probably didn't like, and definitely didn't want to spend your wedding night with under the approving gaze of your drunk uncle. The utter misery of it all boils down to a profound lack of personal agency, a relentless focus on economic and political gain, and a casual disregard for individual happiness or bodily autonomy. So, after all this, after reliving the dirt, the disease, the dowries, the dilemmas, the damnation, you still want to get married medieval style? Didn't think so. I mean, unless your lifelong dream involves a partner who thinks bathing is a radical political statement, a wedding night involving an audience, and a deep existential dread of producing only daughters, then perhaps not. Let this serve as a powerful, pungent reminder to appreciate your modern choices and conveniences. Appreciate that you can swipe left on a terrible date, or that your marriage, if you're in one, is hopefully built on mutual respect and affection. Send a silent, shuddering thank you to the ancestors who endured this profound, systematic suckage, because without their grim fortitude, you wouldn't be here, blissfully enjoying your modern dating woes. If you've managed to stay awake through this unflinching look at historical marital misery and haven't yet run screaming into the comforting embrace of a lifetime of singlehood, consider subscribing. Or don't. History, much like your medieval spouse, really doesn't care. It simply exists in all its brutal, smelly, unromantic glory. Until next time, stay safe, stay modern, and for the love of all that is holy, take a bath.